Hello, everyone. Today we will be recording an interview with Dr. Richard White to understand why interconnected histories of the transatlantic slavery and anti-slavery movements have been remembered, forgotten, commemorated, and/or ignored. Dr. White is an English artist and researcher who holds a professional background in participatory media and education, as well as a lecturer at Basketball University. White has his creative practice PhD at the university and performs ongoing research to address physical, sensory, emotional, and intellectual experiences of walking in different places. He leads student walks throughout the UK, focusing on what students see and don't see. These ideas are recorded and tracked through live social media feeds that work to record memories, photographs, and impressions of these walks, which allow students to reimagine the past in a creative manner, to understand why some aspects of the transatlantic slavery past are celebrated while others are either ignored or covered up. So now I'm going to pass it on to Elma and Karl to ask Dr. White about more of his work and his findings.
Okay, so I'm just going to start off with a few introductory questions and general questions. So the locations you choose for your walks hold extreme importance, and they not only bring history to life, but they also force people to face the past and form somewhat of an emotional connection with history. So what inspired you to start doing these walks, and why do you think they're so important?
Well, I've been doing walking arts work for really quite a long time now. My background was in participatory media, working in community arts, community media, that kind of thing, before finding a bit of a niche in academic work, which is where I kind of pays the bills. It's what I do part-time, I suppose. And there was a particular occasion where I've been doing this very, very long walk with a whole group of people, and we were exploring so in England, on the hills and the chalk downs in England, there are these white horse kind of figures, and we've been exploring and feeling them and thinking about them and doing all of that. And there were a variety of things that came up that really challenged me to think about ethical practice. My partner was one of the people that said to me she doesn't walk very much, and she sort of said, what about and the sort of thought came up, well, what about all the people that walk and have walked over time? It hasn't been for pleasure. So there are the whole stories of the European pogroms. There are the stories of people who, and right now are kind of walking across Europe because, they're refugees from one place. All the stories of, for example, women walking to work, walking to get water, all of that kind of stuff. And that was quite a sea change in my practice, moving towards thinking about other kinds of walking and other reasons for walking, other than just go, hey, it's a nice day, let's go out for a walk, and starting to think a bit more about it.
Thank you. So because so much of the history we learn in grade school is heavily romanticized based on where we're from, and it promotes ideas of our countries that aren't necessarily true, how do you make sure that you avoid sort of this ideology? Or do you?
Yeah, very much so. One of the sort of the angles that I've come in at this is exploring that there is very much, and again, I'm not sure that this is true. It may be true for you in Canada, but in England, there's very much this sort of idea of the countryside as an enchantment, that we kind of go out and commune with nature, and it's all beautiful and dreamy and la 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 and all of that kind of stuff. And one of my approaches is what I call disenchanted walking. And so it's very deliberately designed to kind of create moments of challenge, moments of dissonance, moments where people start to think in a different way, in a critical way. So, for example, in terms of developing this practice, one of my earlier pieces was part of a program of walks called Forced Walks, and we did a project called Honouring Esther, in which we retraced the route of a Nazi death march. And I took the route, so there's loads of kind of mapping technology and mucking around with stuff in it, but short version is, took a route of a Nazi death march and took that as a line, retaining its orientation, so both the distance and its, you know, north-southness. And then I superimposed that on Somerset, so that it finished near where I live, where I am at the moment. There's Bath has an old Jewish burial ground where the dead are respected. So we deliberately contrasting that with the mass graves at Belsen, where the dead are very much not respected, or were not respected. But much of that walk was through what you might think of as England's green and pleasant land. And so what happens is that we were walking, and you'd get these kind of moments where I would use some text or some sounds or something to kind of bring people back to that moment of, well, why are we doing this walk? Well, what this walk we're doing is we are retracing the steps of a person whose testimony that we were using, Esther, who survived a Nazi death march. And it was a very powerful experience for the people involved, and had that effect of what I describe as a disenchantment. So it doesn't mean to say you can't go out and have a nice walk in the sunshine. And it was a beautiful spring weekend where we did that and all the rest of it. But actually there were moments where, and it made it in a way even more poignant to kind of just bring us back. Hang on, what's this walk about? Let's have that consideration and let's have that conversation. And in fact, when we were doing that particular walk, it was so this is 4 years ago now. It was a time when on the TV screens in Europe, we were seeing many of the sort of, I suppose, the first big wave of refugees coming out through Turkey and walking through the fields of Eastern Europe. And it looked very similar. And some of the photography, look at my website or whatever, some of the photography that we gathered, you know, it's just very strange. Here we are walking through a field of a yellow flowering crop, and there are shots of refugees coming up through Hungary and very, very similar kinds of things. So it was a very, very, the intention was to create provocations, thought-provoking moments in the walk.
Okay, so that kind of leads into my next question. So many people find that confronting these darker parts of our history, the ones that provoke us to think, makes them uncomfortable. So what do you think about this, and how do you encourage people to continue learning about it, even though it may make them uncomfortable or uneasy?
Well, yeah, the intention is going to be uncomfortable. That's the deal. So, but obviously, being serious for a moment, you know, it is potentially all kinds of triggers there. There's all kinds of things that people will indeed find upsetting. People might learn things that they might learn things that they didn't know already, but more importantly, might start looking at things in ways that they hadn't considered them before. So there's a process that I've used. First of all, you know, everybody gets a really full briefing about what we're going to be doing and what's going to be happening. And part of that is an attempt to kind of anticipate things that might be triggers for people. I do think that the act of walking, simply that thing of walking together with other people, builds a kind of a solidarity. There's that kind of sort of an affective resonance that goes out with the people that you're walking with, and so obviously I try and actively encourage that. So we'll begin with introductions, what brings people here today. We'll begin with something that will relate to the particular walk or issue that we're exploring, why people are engaging with that, and often out of that you'll find particular interests, particular sensibilities. Certainly talking more about the stuff that relates to slave ownership, you start to get into that area of kind of white fragility, the things that people are feeling very uncomfortable about and don't really want to talk about. But again, that process of walking It does. There's something really special about that kind of that corporeal experience of moving your body with a group of people, and so, you know, in a sense, it's kind of, well, there's a trust in the process, and I hope people trust me. I'm not going to play any tricks on anybody. There will be surprises. There will be moments where you'll feel uncomfortable, but you know, it's sort of a bit of a story thing that you try and take people in it, and then you bring them out at the end, and there's a process at the end of it where we'll kind of talk and share and so on. All the walks, I try and encourage people to take photographs, to tweet, to, you know, do social media, to film, to draw. Everybody has a notebook. There's, you know, people draw and collect bits and pieces and stuff. So in ways in which, you know, people have private moments, if you like, that they can kind of reflect themselves and share. So it is, you know, I am aware, very aware. There's a sort of it's not safety netting of the learning, but it is the safety netting of the effective response, if you like, affective response.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to throw it over to Karl so we can start talking about a little bit of your past research.
Hi there, Karl.
Hi, Dr. White. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good. I just want to personally thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. I understand you're very busy, and your flexibility and accommodation has been very appreciated.
Thank you.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Phantom's Walk tour, specifically one from the Byam Portrait to Beckett's Tower.
Yep.
Beckett's Tower. So this one, Huron University actually was participating with you, correct?
Yeah.
So first off, I just want to ask you about the goal and the meaning of this project to you personally, or even maybe the messages you wanted to deliver to participants.
No, people who really don't question stuff. And you walk around Bath, and if you didn't know where the wealth came from, if you didn't know what this beautiful Georgian city is kind of, in a sense, sort of built on, I think, you know, you're missing a whole lot. And so part of, you know, for me, it's a kind of, there's not a finger wagging. I kind of go for the waving the finger. It's not a finger wagging, but it's like saying to people, you know, do you realize, you know, did you know that, you know, the debt that we owe to, you know, all of those people that were shipped out of Africa and went to work in the plantations, and the wealth somehow or another kind of is manifest in these buildings. I think because the tourist stuff doesn't tell you, you know, none of the captions of any of the buildings tell you any of this sort of stuff. It really is what I call a reluctant heritage. You know, it's like kind of people know about it, but they don't want to talk about it. So specifically, what that walk was about. So walking from the Byam Portrait in the Holborn Museum through town and then up to Beckford's Tower was about really walking through something of the order of, you know, 200 years of that period in which the wealth generated by the trade in and also the labour of captured and enslaved Africans was kind of pouring into Britain, yeah, both, and specifically into Bath, and specifically manifest in the Georgian city of Bath. So what I was doing was, there were a number of kind of key points along the way on that walk. Part of it was talking about giving people an opportunity to kind of experience, you know, it's a beautiful city, you know, when this horrible virus is over. I hope you come visit, and to understand why people came there, but to look at some of the houses and to tell a little bit of the story of some of the people there. So the kind of the top and tail of it is the Byam Portrait is a portrait that was painted of the Byam family, and it was painted in Bath by a famous painter called Thomas Gainsborough, and it's a huge, great picture. He painted he painted a few enormous, great pictures, and so you look at it and you think, wow, that's a very interesting picture. But what I find is what I'm kind of doing is reminding people or encouraging people to look at it with a kind of a critical eye, if you like. So just to think about the size of it. So it's like the equivalent of, it's the equivalent of Elon Musk, kind of paying for a space rocket to go to the space center. It's that kind of 18th century equivalent of, well, you've got all of this money. Well, what do you do? Well, you get an enormous great picture painted of yourself and your wife and your child. So it's a status thing. What on earth was Gainsborough doing in Bath? Well, he was making money because people had a load of money to spend, and you can think of modern examples of that. So it's kind of getting those kind of critical elements going. So it's, what does it mean to us now? What are these things saying? So we look at some of the architecture, and these are, they're fantastic buildings, but what's kind of hidden in? What's the matter telling us? What's this stone telling us? What are these shapes cut into the stone? What's that telling us? And there's kind of moments there for reflection, just in the same way as I was describing the way that the Force Walks project worked. So you're kind of, thinking about how the city has changed, but also how things haven't changed, thinking about, who were these people, running some questions about racialization and who we think people are. The question that I always ask myself when I go to places, well, where did the money come from? There's the Watergate film, follow the money. So you follow the money, where does it take you? Although the research exists, the people that run those places, those kind of heritage centres, are really reluctant. It's changing now. The murder of George Floyd and the toppling the Colston statue have really, there's been a bit of a sea change. I hope, touch wood, I hope that there's been a bit of a sea change, and it feels that things are changing. But certainly a year and more ago, so the peak of my work on this was nearly 3 years ago now. And at that time, they just didn't want to talk about it at all. And so when you open it up, so you go into a space and there's the volunteers who show you around Beckford's Tower, and they didn't want to talk about it. Exactly the same as in the museum. If you asked them, well, tell me about this guy Byam, what about him? And they wouldn't, it wouldn't be the first thing that they tell you was actually this guy made all his money on the back of captured and enslaved people.
Absolutely. It sounds like a very eye-opening and, if not like humbling experience for these influential figures, right? You really start to see the truth behind those kinds of things, the unspoken truth.
The other thing that we explored, which was not stuff that I'm particularly well researched on, but it was the story of the abolition movement. As well as being, a manifestation of the wealth that was generated by captured and enslaved people, Bath also was a place where there was a fair amount of campaigning that went on, first of all, for the abolition of the slave trade, which was successful in 1807, and then subsequently for the abolishing of the status of being enslaved in the British Empire, which was eventually successful in the 1830s. And so that's what kind of created that moment, historically. Tell me to shut up if you know what I'm talking about. But that creates that moment when in Canada, because it was part of the British Empire, slavery was illegal. So it enabled I don't know, it gave a destination for the Underground Railroad, or but it meant that and I'm very careful not to put too glossy a gloss on that. The thing that I find slightly uncomfortable is that what happens in Bath is when they get talking about the wealth that was generated as a result of the trading and the labour of all of those captured and enslaved people, and that kind of atrocity that represents over 400 years. What happens in Bath is that they immediately, yes, but we had all the abolitionists as well, and they'll kind of turn to these white abolitionists, and suddenly that's the story. And I'm always rather kind of, yeah, but that's true, but let's have a look at that 400 years of atrocity there first before we talk about these white abolitionists. But having said that, there are connections, and you'll have to excuse me because I can't remember the names, but there were speakers who came through Bath, hosted by the abolitionists, who were self-emancipated slaves, people that had got out on the Underground Railroad, come up to Canada, and then came touring. And of course, there were black people who were no longer slaves, who were also part of that abolition movement, who also spoke in Bath. So it's as you well know, it's not there is a story of racialization in there. The tendency in England is, it's all about these, the old white men, Wilberforce and all of that lot. And let's not talk, and again, you get into that kind of white fragility thing again, let's not talk about the black speakers who came round. So your colleagues were interested in there were black speakers who came round, and there's one particular recorded moment of, got into the local newspaper in a particular chapel which was famous for its abolitionist meetings and speakers. And there were these lovely, I don't know whether, I'm sure you must have them, but we have fair trade shops now where you can go and buy, shirts that are made entirely of bamboo that's, not been taken from pandas and, all of that kind of, jolly good stuff. And so back in the day, there were like fair trade shops, and they were raising money for the abolition movement and for the Underground Railroad, and they were called depots, and that just sort of resonated with the idea of a railroad. So there are all kinds of connections through that kind of struggle for freedom that the Underground Railroad represents, as well in Bath.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a lot of positive results then from this walk, and I would say that in a way here in Canada we kind of relate to that. There's a dark side behind every history when it specifically comes to Native American history in Canada. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you a story of that one. So, and it's one of those kind of beautiful ironies. So one of the I don't know if you've seen any photographs of Bath, but the Holborn Museum, where the barn portrait is at the end of this grand avenue, which was part of the Pulteney estate. And William Pulteney was a slave owner and basically a speculator, who he built this estate with the thought that those kinds of people, it wasn't just slave owners who had estates in the Caribbean. It was also some who came back from what became the United States, but also the growing kind of network of people who were benefiting off the empire in the East were coming to Bath. And his developments, this investment in this development, the banks went bust. And at the same time, this guy is speculating, is involved in speculation on the result of the American War of Independence. And when the British lost, all the indigenous people, all the First Nations, American Indians who had sided with the British, the Americans said, you know those treaties you signed? Well, you can forget about those and get out. And what happened was the land that was so it's sort of more or less straight south of you, that kind of upstate New York, all that bit that comes up to the river. It's called the it's like the Fingertip Lakes or the Finger Lakes or something like that. And that whole area of land was then sold, and Pulteney speculated. So he was involved in a purchase. It was called the Pulteney Purchase, and he speculated on that land. So they bought it for like $1 an acre or even less, and then obviously sold it off for a whole lot more. And it explains why, right in the middle of upstate New York, if you look at the map, There's a bath there, and that's why, because he was the Duchess of Bath, Duke of Bath or something, Marquis of Bath, and I was just sort of following through the Underground Railroad thing. So there you've got a man made all his money on speculation, but his starting capital comes from the ownership of enslaved people. That part of it goes bust. The next bit of his money he makes speculating on essentially the lands of indigenous people in the northern part of America. And the Underground Railroad goes right through the middle of it. And in Bath, there was a safe house in Bath, New York State. There was a safe house there. And that's one of the little links that I'd really like to kind of, there's definitely a sort of, the names that appear to be respectable people in Bath, once you start finding out where their money came from, you find that, they had no, there was no sense of, ethics in their practice, despite the fact that a lot of people were calling for it at the time. They just exploited people and land and, all the rest of it.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. That's very informative, and actually it connected well to our previous discussion there, question. I'm just going to pass it off to Elma now. She has a few more questions for you.
Okay, so the next walk I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit was the Sweetwaters, the legacy of slave ownership.
Yeah.
So this walk was meant to, as it says on your website, help people reflect on what went down the river and what returned at the nexus of the triangular trade, which is trade among 3 ports or regions, as well as discover what was made using the wind and water energy, local labor, and wealth generated by enslaved people. So what was your goal going into this project, and why did you believe that this history specifically was important to share?
Well, without repeating myself, it's all part and parcel of that kind of process. It's dark here now, but where I'm sitting, I'm looking out a window over there, and I'm looking right down the River Avon. And one of the things that has always fascinated me, and it's part of the walking practice, is that sort of feeling for, how did this come to be? How did this landscape come to be? How did these buildings come to be? It's that sort of, it's a discovery thing, but it's a discovery at a kind of more visceral kind of level, and more emotional kind of level. So I was really interested once. So there's a really big idea in here, which I'm not going to apologise for, but it's a bit difficult to explain. But there's an idea of that in a drop of rain, or in a single tear, contains the entire history of the universe. So it's Timothy Morton, if you come across his writing. So water is hydrogen and oxygen, the first of the atoms that were made at the beginning, that first kind of moment in time. When you consider the trade in people across the Atlantic during that period of the sort of, when sort of Britain, Portugal, to some extent France and Spain, but Britain, Portugal, and some of the other European nations were at it. So that kind of 400-year long atrocity. The estimates are of the order that about a third of the lives that were taken didn't make it to their destination. So if you think about that, that's like 4-5 million people dumped overboard, drowned, dead in the Atlantic. And that idea was running in my head all the way through this. And so then you kind of take it back. Well, okay, so on just down the river from here where I'm looking, there's an old brass mill where they were making brass goods. Those brass goods were going on the boats from Bristol down to West Africa, and they were making things called manillas. And Manila's is like a kind of a bangle. I should have one here that I could show you. But if you think about a bangle, and it's a form of wearable wealth. And so that, along with particular kind of shells, were the two forms of wealth. And so that became an economic exchange. So you could argue, and I play with the idea, that down the river here, on each of those brass mills, it's like the mint. That's where they were making the money, making the way of exchanging, transferring wealth for that period of Britain's colonial kind of expansion. But then on top of that, so what's that powered by? It's powered by water. It's a water mill. It's churning away. We went and we visited with some of the previous students. We visited it, and it's just pumping away, turning and turning and turning. And that stuff goes down the river to Bristol. Well, all of those ships, how are they traveling? Well, they're traveling on the water. And then when you get to, so then, there's the whole kind of horror of the exchange, and the sort of, people kept in appalling conditions on those boats and all the rest of it. Get into to the plantations. The plantations rely on water. So one of the things was sugar needs a lot of irrigation for it to be able to grow and have a good make lots of sugar to grow to flourish. And you bring that back to England. So as that wealth comes back to England, some of that wealth, much of that wealth, gets translated not only into the kind of English country houses, but it also gets translated into the parks. So you may have heard of I don't know, in England, we're told all of this history. There's famous landscape gardeners. There's this guy called Capability Brown and people like that. And so they were paid to, and they dug lakes, and it's all about water. So there's a kind of a water thing that kind of connects this whole thing up. It connects it at a material level, if you like. So that making and transport of material stuff. It resonates there in terms of the how wealth manifests itself in these kind of watery kinds of gardens, the lakes, the reflecting lakes, and so on of the famous English country gardens. But at the core of it is that sort of is the water cycle, which is going on the whole time, and so bringing it right up to date. What I was inviting people to reflect on when it rained, obviously, but that rain, our weather here in the west of England, southwest of England, our weather comes off the Atlantic. That's the prevailing wind. Everything comes off the Atlantic. So when it rains, if you think of that idea of a drop of rain or a tear containing the entire history of the universe, it also contains the memories, the languages, the voices, the cries of those people who were killed, were drowned in the, were chucked overboard because they resisted and got beaten up or got ill or whatever. And it's a very, I'm just saying that to you, it's a very chilling kind of thing when you just sort of stand by one of these rich houses and you just reflect on that. Perhaps as a little bit of a Atlantic mist is blowing in your face.
Okay, so you mentioned that on your website that some of the slave owners received compensation when they were no longer allowed to own human beings. So the economies of many of these countries revolved around slavery and being able to own slaves. So many people were obviously heavily impacted by the abolishment of it. Can you tell me a little bit more about this compensation specifically and how the governments of these countries help people adjust?
Well, in many ways, that was a kind of a starting point of it gave me little nodes to walk on. So in that process of campaigning for, first of all, to abolish the slave trade, and then subsequently to abolish the status of slavery in the British Empire. So when they abolished the slave trade, a lot of the West Indian merchant interest. It's after the loss of the colonies in the United States. So things kind of change a little bit. But after 1807, the West India Planters Association kind of moved towards a point for justifying the status of slavery. So there's a whole load of things that you can read where they're kind of saying, well, it's a good thing, and we're doing these people a favor, and we're teaching them to be Christians, and all of that, all kind of deeply racist kind of stuff. And they imagine all of these families, like the Byams, like the Beckhams, and so on, Beckfords. They've all kind of intermarried, and they form in Westminster, the seat of government in London. They form this really tight, it's not a conspiracy, but they're all each other's mates, and they all vote for it. And the one thing that they want to hang on to is that status of slavery, because basically, what a great state of affairs. You've got this industry that's making mainly sugar, but a load of other stuff as well, and you don't have to pay your workers. What fantastic setup is that? Recipe for making loads of money. So they don't want to lose that. But at the same time, there are a load of other interests, and for 100 years or so, some of the religious groups, some of the Christian outfits, but many other groups have been campaigning against that. Also, a series of really big uprisings in the Caribbean, and as well as that, Caribbean weather, and the shift of interest towards the British Empire in the East rather than in the West, because of the loss of the colonies in America. And so what happens is, it's not like two forces kind of meet, but essentially the government, there is a majority to completely get rid of the status of slavery, and they realise that really the only way that they're going to be able to do it and sort of all stay mates together kind of thing in that sort of very British way is by buying off the slave owners. So they come up with this idea of a compensation scheme. And what's interesting for us now is, because they came up with that, it means that there was a kind of an audit, and they went through. So there was lots of, in the early stages, it was all stuff to do with how those enslaved people were treated and the conditions that they were working and living under. And then it becomes, transitions towards something that's much more about, well, how much are these people worth? So there's a whole slew, there's a huge, great archive of all of this stuff. And eventually the abolition package was, so they abolished the status of slave in the British Empire, first of all in the west of the British Empire, and all the slave owners were able to make a compensation claim. So that means you've got a legal record. So that means we could know their names, we know where they lived, and so on. So there are addresses in Bath, and there's a brilliant database that the University College London have done, and it's called The Legacies of British Slave Ownership. Very, very accessible, and so even people like me, I'm not an archivist or anything, I can go in and I can type in names, and it's all trial and error, and eventually this astonishing picture comes up of all of these people in Bath who claimed now, so it's £20 million that they paid out. So that's, you're probably talking about £20 billion that they paid out, a lot of money. And again, in today's terms, several millions, maybe tens of millions of pounds came into Bath as a result of claims made by slave owners for compensations. And it should be said, not a penny went to the enslaved people. Nothing has ever gone to those enslaved people, and they've never received an apology. And it's shameful for the British government. I'm ashamed.
It's just, I guess, having that database, because of the compensation, it does make it a little bit easier to now study how many slave owners there were, and like who they were, what families it was.
Absolutely. And they've done so I was working, so it was, I think it was about 2016, I think, that it was released, maybe a bit before that. And so I'm looking now at doing, got the PhD, because that was one of the things that I really went for in my PhD research. Now looking to, particularly in this time of the virus, how do we can't walk together, so how do we do it? So I'm trying to crack that at the moment. But that's also taking me back into that original archival research, and finding that, gosh, they've added to it, so now you can, because a lot of this stuff has been digitized, so as well as the specific compensation kind of legal stuff, all of that was digitized quite a while back, but now you can go in and it will take you where the records exist. It'll take you to family records, it'll take you to plantation records, so really it's a brilliant gateway if you're looking to kind of research the story of, I guess, Britain and the Caribbean, that kind of relationship.
Okay, awesome. So one thing that I found really interesting on your website about this specific project was the portion you have about legacies. So you mentioned both the legacies of the slave owners and those enslaved. You mentioned that slave owners were left with a white-skinned dominance that became a long-lasting racism, as well as wealth embodied in things like landscapes, cityscapes, and country houses, while those who were enslaved were left with inherited trauma of enslavement, abduction, rape, violence, and degradation, as well as new cultures fashioned from their carried beliefs, skills, stories, and memories. So obviously we're learning in this class about race, rights, and revolution. We're studying both history and our society today. So how do you think these legacies are seen in like the world we're living in today? And like what connections can you make?
Good question. I think first of all, I have to put in the preface that this is entirely off the top of my head, although I think about it a lot. So that's my response. The other response is, I'm a white man, I'm getting old, and I'm living in Bath. I have a lot of privilege. So I'm coming at this from a very, very privileged position. So there are many of the legacies of slave ownership. I inherit those as privilege. So I've inherited those as privilege in my education. I inherit them as privilege in, as a result in what I work and where I work and all of that. So there's a whole, that Peggy McIntosh thing about the kind of knapsack of privilege that's white privilege. Come across that idea? Well, there's all sorts of things that I can kind of pull out of my knapsack and sort of it's privilege. So to be talking about those legacies through that, let's say through that. So there's things like thinking about the legacies as it impinges on the descendants of those who were enslaved. There are all kinds of things that I can't even get my head inside or around. But there are some things of that I'm able to, appreciate or connect with. So one element of it is, if you like, the systemic racism that just in this country, it's kind of everywhere. It's the police, it's the judiciary, it's education. We have conversations about, what we learned in our schooling. Now I'm an older person now, but I still hear the same thing. So that there's people I know in Bath who, so I've discovered, because I've been interested in it, this whole story of where Bath comes in, but it's still not taught in the schools. And in fact, there was a government minister in Parliament said that they would stop, or I forget the actual words they used, but they were definitely very unhappy about the teaching of radical race theory, critical race theory. So that idea of that these kind of legacies and how they are embodied in our education system and so on. There are also other legacies. I was trying to get to music, but I find it's uncomfortable to kind of get there. There, you know, there is no doubt that the music of the Caribbean and the music that kind of evolved out of that cross-Atlantic kind of interaction, you know, that was forced and was part of that kind of industrialized atrocity, is something which, you know, I like reggae, I like jazz, I like blues, you know, all of those kinds of things that kind of comes out of it. But I suppose what I'm saying is, you know, I enjoy those, but increasingly there's a, you know, it's like the idea of disenchantment that I was talking about before. That doesn't mean to say, you know, I can't go to see a good reggae band and, you know, have a good dance and really enjoy it. But at the same time, there's an awareness that I think is important about, well, where did that come from? How did that come to be? And so, you know, this is just kind of ongoing. It's ongoing kind of critical thoughts around all of that, which is to do with music, dance, and literature, I guess, and to some extent filmmaking, but certainly the music of the Caribbean and the music that's come out of America, from the sort of the cultures of enslaved people and descendants of enslaved people in America. So kind of that sort of Black music, and how do I engage or not engage with Black music? And yeah, so
thank you. I definitely agree. Topics like slavery, for example, are absolutely necessary for understanding the role of race in our society today. So I think historians like you give important context, despite the privilege you may have as a white man. You bring important context to the conversations that we have to have today because of what's going on. So thank you.
Yeah, just to finish that one, you know, a lot of people said to me, so we have for a month each year, we have Black History Month, and it's, you know, it began as a good thing. It's now, it's a bit like International Women's Day, you know, and people say, why isn't there International Men's Day? Well, that's the rest of the year. And the flip side of Black History Month is, well, so you get 11 months of white history. Well, we need to kind of spread it around a bit. But people also say to me, oh, you should do one of your walks for Black History Month. And my response is, well, yes, but this is about white history. This is about white English history. It's about how racism got so embedded in English, British culture. And so I feel the people who I want to be talking with and engaging with, and getting to think in this critical and questioning way through a creative process, it's white people. And that's the sort of, it's kind of reflecting and getting through that sort of, yeah, it's getting through white fragility and being able to, you know, be a human, you know. That's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you very much. I'm going to throw it back to Karl now.
Okay.
Thank you, Elma. I just wanted to add in, Dr. White, that despite the recognition of your privilege and perhaps maybe a lack of your direct personal experience with racism, your dedication, your passion it's very clear. So we appreciate the enthusiasm here. So I'm just going to move on to some of your current work, recent work, walking with the names. From your website, we can see that this walk is through the Bath's workhouse burial grounds, and that you spoke the names of victims of 3,000 unmarked graves. Can you tell us a little bit more about this project?
Yeah, so a bit of English social history. So back at the same time, and it's all about the way that the ruling elite, I think, in England, their attitude towards ordinary people, regardless of the colour of their skin. So back at the beginning of the 19th century, so similar kind of time that we're talking about in terms of thinking about the ending of the slave trade and the status of slavery. There were lots of people kind of on the road. You know, people were being moved off the land and encouraged to come into the cities, and there was then a question also, what do we do with the poor? What do we do with people who can't work? People who are injured, people who are unwell, people who are old. And what they did was they set up places called workhouses. Now, there've been workhouses before, but in the 19th century, they were brought into quite sort of large, large, imposing buildings. And you'll find them in most, well, I was going to say most cities, but in fact, you'll find them in most towns in England, these old, large buildings, the workhouses. And if you read your Charles Dickens, there's all sorts of stories of people who end up in the workhouse. These were places where really it was a punishment to be poor. So it was a kind of punitive regime, and they do all sorts of menial jobs, or they were if they could, people were sort of farmed out to go and be servants and things like that. Once you were in a workhouse, it was very difficult to get out, and once you were in a workhouse, you became kind of separated from family, your community, and so on. And it was literally, it was like a kind of a dumping ground for the poor in 19th century England. And so what happens when you die? So, and that's what this project is all about. So I've been doing a load of stuff with around the workhouse in Bath. We found all sorts of, again, kind of interesting archive stuff that you could kind of reflect on. And I was working with this local writer, poet, John Payne, whose grandparents are buried in this field. So it's a field about the size of a couple of football pitches, and you wouldn't know it if you went there. It's just a field in front of a small block of flats. In this field, there are more than 3,000 people who died of poverty in the workhouse. Their bodies were just maybe we're not really sure whether they were just wrapped in cloth and buried, or maybe kind of a makeshift wooden coffin that they were put in. There's no headstones, no memorials to them, and there's no memorial there at all. On the current map of Bath, it's not even marked as a graveyard or as a burial ground. And it really kind of sums up that kind of attitude towards ordinary people, towards the sort of the people at the bottom end of society, that basically, once you've done your time working, then you dump your bodies, So in 19th century England, Victorian England, it was a big thing to have what they called a decent burial. So it's sort of, again, if you've read any, not that you should, but if you've read any kind of English literature, Dickens, that kind of thing, there was quite a kind of cult around sort of mortality and death, and there are these grand cemeteries in the cities with these enormous memorials and things like that for the people who had money. And if you didn't have anything, literally, you got dumped in a hole in the ground. From children, literally days old, to people in their early 90s. So, the whole range. And every single one of those, a little tragedy. And so there's there was a kind of, I wouldn't say it's even anything as strong as a campaign, but there was a feeling that should be, John wanted to get something up there for his grandparents, but that there should be some sort of memorializing. And so what happened was that I said, well, okay, well, let's just read the names and see what happens. So again, this is thanks to all those people digitizing archives. So the names of the people, the burial register is digitized, so you can get those names. and very easily you can establish the year of their birth and the day of their burial. And they were buried in batches, you know, so you get, you know, they weren't going to hire a priest just for one person. They wait until they got 4 or 5, and then we'll chuck them all in the ground and we'll say a few words over them, sort of thing. And we've been doing that for the past over a year now, just on a year now, and we'll finish in next March, reading each name of everyone that was buried there, who died of poverty in the Bath Union workhouse, and reading that in the order that in which they were buried. So we're in the middle 1880s, beginning of December, we'll read a few from the middle of the 1880s. And it's evolved into really quite an astonishing little project. So we carried on during lockdown. So we were all locked down here from March through till May. And so people continued to walk and read names. So every month I'll do a mail shot out, see who's up for it. And so people were reading when they were doing their own little walk in their backyard. I read a couple of times in my backyard here. We were at, some people live nearby, like it's up the hill from me, so it was further than I could go there and back in an hour according to the regulations. So I missed one of them actually walking on the burial ground, but there are people who live right on top, you know, right, not on top of it, but right next door, who walked, and they recorded their readings. They shared those with me, and then I edited those up. So if you look to the website, you'll see a series of years where I've edited those readings up together. We had contributions from, so there's, you know, from far and wide, including Denmark, so from out of this country as well. And we started to make little sort of name flags, and we've been sticking those up at a sort of a central point in the place. And what it has provoked, so, you know, there's one thing which is a really important thing, which is about just calling out the names. There's something incredibly powerful about doing that. And, you know, if you think, you know, a child buried there who was 6 months old, you know, they maybe hardly ever heard their name called. You know, certainly a child a few days old, maybe their name had only ever been called out in this world once or twice. And there's something very powerful about doing that and hearing other people doing that. So we're reading together. And what happened when you know, so again, I don't know how it's been in Canada, but here, you know, every night on the news, there's the statistics of how many people have got it, how many people in hospital, and how many people died each day. And, you know, we're trying to remember 3,000 odd people who died of poverty over a 50, 60-year period. There was something some strange and powerful resonances in, at the same time, somehow we were also remembering the people who were dying of the virus. And in this country, the sort of the evolution of the workhouse goes into the care of elders and older people. So the government has kind of pretty much privatized the sort of the ordinary people's end of care for the elderly, and they really, you know, they were not careful in terms of the spread of the virus. So a lot of the deaths that came up were older people in underfunded care homes. So we started to find, without anybody saying it explicitly, that, you know, it was almost, that's what you're thinking of when you were reading. So it became the sort of, without it being explicit, there became a kind of there was a resonance there for those who were dying literally right now. And that's ongoing. So we had a break where they let us out in the summer. And in September, if you look on my website, to find the September one, it's right up at the top. We invited a group of people, so folk musicians, to come and play, and it was just an astonishing experience. They were playing music from the period, so they're playing music that would have been familiar to those who were buried back in the middle of the 19th century. Some of it was jolly, some of it was a bit more formal, a bit more slow, but it was like, if you can imagine, and you know, we're just imagining out of nowhere really, but imagining maybe what that decent burial, that decent funeral, that wake might have been. It was like they played the soundtrack for that, and it was just really lovely. It's I think it's about a little 10-minute piece on the website. Have a look at it, and it's still going. We're due to finish reading through the names in March, and then we hope that by then, we all hope we're out of the virus and we're all still alive, and we hope that will be a moment of kind of leverage for both the church, it's still consecrated ground, and the council, because they still own the ground, of you know, a bit more of a formal memorialisation. But I don't know, you know, I'm more into the sort of the living thing than statues and plaques and all that sort of stuff. Hope to get some tree. We've been doing a bit of guerrilla planting as well, but we won't tell anybody that. So maybe some bulbs will come up, you never know.
Thank you, Dr. White. It's obviously a very powerful project, especially during the times we're living in right now. Yeah. So I'm just going to move on to Sam. He has, just in the interest of time, he has some concluding questions to ask you. So Sam, if you can take it away.
Hi there, Sam.
Hi, Dr. White. Thank you again, before I start with just wrapping up our interview, thank you again for taking the time to talk to us about this important subject. So we've hit a lot of main points talking about slavery and the authorized history, and institutions talking about what they want to talk about rather than an omission of the truth, and preferably talking about what the general public and possibly what history is rather important with, such as the ideas of race, where this wealth came from, how it's affected society today. So we've hit a lot of topics on that, in such things like the Nazi death marches and superimposing that onto a map of England. So to walk through that and see the shoes of what may have other people have seen, allowing those today to experience somewhat, or a glimpse of what people in the past might have experienced. And I believe through walking, we've talked about how it's important to the emotional connection with the physical space and being able to see through the lens of history and through the eyes of others what we can connect to today in our connection to the past and to the present. So I know this is a long question, but through all this interview and all that we've talked about, what are the main points that someone should take away from everything we've talked about in the entirety of this interview? I know it's a tough question, but we've just jumped through a lot of topics, and just in the interest of, for someone who may want a 15-minute glimpse of your walks, what could they take away from it?
Wow. God, you stumped me. So there's some, well, I don't know. You just have to stop me. So there's, I think the walking is really important. So the corporeal experience, that sense of being with other people whilst you're walking, whilst you're moving together, generates a different kind of thinking. So, you know, just if you think about it, you know, what goes on, actually just being able to stand up, what goes on when you actually start walking, that kind of movement of your body in space it's an amazing thing. And you are, if you start to kind of think about that, it takes you, there's something about kind of taking you inside and being thoughtful about how your body is moving, but also what you're feeling and what you know, experiencing is almost taking it too far. You know, you're feeling the wind on your face, you're feeling the rain, you know, what I was talking about, the rain from the Atlantic for us here in Bath. You know, that is it's a tactile experience, and in my work, that element is really, that's a kind of it's a foundational element. And to that, what I'm doing is I'm kind of throwing in questions and provocations, and okay, so we're having this experience, we're having this embodied experience, we are knowing these spaces and these places in a different kind of way than we normally do when we're just going out down the shops or whatever you do, and what I'm doing is throwing in critical dissonance moments that ask questions. So I think that kind of the thing to, I don't know whether it's a takeaway or the thing to kind of come into the work with is this idea of walking and asking questions, and asking questions isn't necessarily those kind of questions like, you know, what was the year that Canada got independence, or whatever kinds of those sort of stupid date questions that you get asked. They're questions like, well, what happens if I put my foot there? What happens if I hold that thing? What does this feel like? You know, what does this computer feel like? It's hot. It's those kind of questions. And if you kind of weave through that some critical questions that it is opening up some kind of understanding about that idea of authorized heritage, you know, that there is, you know, so an idea of authorized heritage, well, there must be somebody or some institution somewhere that's authorizing it. There's an official version. Well, what about all the stuff that gets left out? What about the absences? What about what they call the amnesia of official history? You know, the bits that they don't want to talk about, the kind of the white fragile versions of it. You know, I know there's a really strong kind of thread in Canada talking about the amnesia as far as the relationship between the white state, the settler state, and the First People, the First Nations. You know, it's that kind of stuff. So you find yourself walking in a place, and I must say, I had an amazing walk where I was with you, in not you personally, but in London, you collectively, and I walked out into, there was some waterway and along through a park. I was looking for the gravestones, so it's my stuff again. I was looking for the gravestones of the Tolpuddle martyrs, who are founders of the trade union movement in England. So there was a kind of a bit of a pilgrimage that I was doing. But one of the things that I was struck by in such a different way than I am here is I kept thinking, whose land's this? You know, this is. I don't think that so much in England, except in a sort of privatisation way, you know, some bastard landowner.
Yeah.
I was thinking in a very different kind of way about, you know, who cares for this space? Who is the trustee of this land? These kind of different ways of knowing the land. So it's kind of walking and asking questions. Yeah, walking and asking questions. There you go.
So I've once heard a quote from a very favorite history professor of mine, which was, we can never truly experience what those in the past have experienced themselves, but we can see through their eyes a glimpse of what we might understand today. So you don't agree? You disagree?
I think that I don't think you can see through anybody's eyes apart from your own. I think I would ask. There's a great question, which let's see if I can. So it's Donna Haraway, feminist writer, and she asks the question: with whose blood were my eyes crafted? Something along those lines. So I think that you have. I don't think I can see through anybody's eyes apart from my own, and I know that I see from a position of white privilege and as a man, and I am forever trying to deconstruct that and critique that. So
of course, well,
I'm sorry if that was your history.
No. Of
another
course,
perspective. It's another perspective.
Of course, there's always another perspective. Well, thank you for all of your time and for answering all of our questions about this topic, and thank you again. And what's next for your walks in terms of post-COVID? What can we possibly see?
Well, I'm hatching one up at the moment, which is to do with the story of botany and empire. So it begins in a park in Bath, where there is a very, very tall tree, and that tall tree is a sequoia. And so I don't know whether you know this, but sequoia was a kind of a like he wasn't a kind of leader, but he was a sort of a wise person. Can't remember which American Indian nation it was, but anyway, he was a wise man, Iroquois, I think. But his contribution is that he developed a system of writing that they could write their own language at the point that the white settlers slaughtered them, and the Trail of Tears and all of the rest of it. And that name is kind of held in that tree. And in Britain, they argued over what to call that tree, and they wanted to call it the Wellingtonia. And Wellington was slave owning, defender of the slave trade, defender of slave ownership, and great British military hero and prime minister. And that relationship with botany and empire is something that I'm interested in exploring.
That's very interesting.
And it's a walk around the trees in the park and teasing out some of those elements. So I've got a script at the moment, but I want to do the walk.
Of course. Well, post-COVID, we hope to see more of the walk and potentially some Instagram or some photos from the walk. Perfect. Thank you, Dr. White.
Time, Richard.
Okay, you're very welcome, and give my regards to your colleagues, fellow students,
of course,
and staff at Huron College. It's been a great connection.
Thank you. You've been amazing
Perfect.
from the start.
Thank you.
Much.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Have a good
Cheers.
one.
Take care.